Automotive Pyathlon. In today's video, I'll be walking you through how to build an application in VBA. And this will be a basic application, but it will cover a lot about subroutines and macros. And it will also cover loops and if statements. So it's going to be a information-packed video, and I hope you learn a lot from it. But here's the application we'll be building. So here we have some sales data, and let's say you want to get how much sales you had in each region. Well, this is what our application does. You can click this button, you can enter a region. So let's say you want to see how much revenue do we have from the East region. You can just click OK or hit enter, and then it tells you how much revenue we have from the East region. You can do this with any of the other regions, or if I wanted to do West, then it works for that also. And if you enter some gibberish, then it will present you with an error box. So this is the application we're going to be building in today's video, so let's dive right in. The first thing we have to do is create a macro. A macro is also known as a subroutine, and so in order to create one in VBA, you have to use this sub keyword, which is short for subroutine, which remember is just another word for macro. So after you have the keyword sub, the next thing you need is the name of your sub. So whatever you're going to call your subroutine, that goes right after the keyword sub. And this function, or this subroutine, I mean, will simply get the region from our user. So east, west, south, north, we're going to get that user input with using an input box, and then we're going to use that to call another subroutine where we'll calculate the total revenue from that region. Alright, so let's make this first sub to figure out which region does our user want to get information from. And we'll just call this get region from user. Notice how when you type the name of your sub and hit enter, it automatically adds these parentheses and the end sub. Every time you have a subroutine in VBA, it always starts with sub and always ends with this end sub. So we're going to indent our code because we want this to look nice, and indenting code is best practice. And we need to figure out which region do we want to get. So we're going to create a string. If you're not familiar with strings or how to declare variables in VBA, we have a whole video on that on our page, so you can go check that out and then come back here. So we're going to create this region variable that's going to store a string. And we want this variable to be set to whatever region our user inputs inside of our input box. So we're going to have an input box, and the way you can do that in VBA is you just type input box, and then you have open and close parentheses and open and close quotations inside of them. And then you're just going to have, what do you want your input box to say? So we want our user to enter a region, so we'll say please enter a region. Now there's actually a second argument you can add into an input box, which will actually be the name, the title of your input box. And so since we're getting a region, we'll just title it region. And that should be within quotations. Alright, so now we have our region string, and we're going to use the input box to get what region does our user want to get the information about. So we're going to have an if statement next, and this if statement is going to say if the region is east, then we're going to get the region total for the east region. Then we're going to have the same thing for west, south, north, and then we're going to have a catch-all case where if they don't enter a valid direction, we'll just give them a message box that says error, please enter a valid region. So the way you can do an if statement in VBA is you can do if, and we're going to be checking the value of our region variable. So we'll say if region equals east, then. So in VBA, you always have to use this if-then construction if your code is going to be going on multiple lines. And then we're going to indent inside of our if statement. And for here, we'll just say get region total for east. So this apostrophe, this is creating a comment, so this is code that won't run. We're going to go back and change this later once we have our if and our else if statements and our else case built out. We'll go back and change this and actually put in the code. So we want to do else if can be read as otherwise. So if region is east, then we'll get the region total for east. Otherwise, if region is west, then, and we can do the same thing. I'm actually just going to copy this and paste it here and change that to west. And then we can do the same thing. Actually, I'll copy both of these, and that will be north, and that will be south. So let's change that to north and south. Now, so those are the four cases, the four valid cases. But we also want to add another case where if they enter something else. And for that, we can just say else, which will be our catch-all case. And if they don't enter east, west, north, or south, then we'll just give them a message box. If you're not familiar with message boxes, we also covered that in our last video where we talked about data types, so you can go back and check out that video. And we'll just message box the user saying, error, please enter a valid region. And I'll fix that typo there. And we also need, after our if statement, we need to tell VBA our if statement is over. So we'll just have this line that says end if, which is ending our if statement, letting VBA know that that's where our end statement comes to a conclusion. All right, so let's actually go back in here and replace some of these comments with what we want to do. But before we do that, we're actually going to create our second subroutine. So we'll do sub, and this is going to be called get region total. You can call these subs whatever you want. Just make sure if you use a different name, you're using that name consistently throughout so that your code works. And this subroutine is actually going to take in input. So we have this parameter, and it's going to be a string. It's going to take in a string that's going to contain the region we want to get the information from. So we want to get the region, and VBA needs to know what data type is this region that we're passing in. So we need to say as string. Then when you hit enter, once again it'll add that end sub automatically for you. So we have our second subroutine that's configured to take input when we call it. So we can go back up to our first subroutine, and now we can call that subroutine. So we're going to call, which is how you actually get this code to run. And we haven't built that out, that's why we just got that error. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say get region total. Once again, I have another typo. Get region total, and we need to pass in what is going to become this region. So here we'll pass in east. Then we can do the same thing here. We can call get region total for west. And I'll just copy and paste this for north and south. So I know for beginning programmers, what we're doing here can get a little complicated. So once I finish with this, I will go back and explain what exactly this code is doing. So we have two subroutines. This second subroutine accepts a region that will be a string. That's what we're passing in here. So every time we use the word region in this second subroutine, it's actually going to be referring to whatever we pass in, and it's going to be a string. So when I say pass in, I'm just saying what we put between these parentheses when we call our region. Call is just a programmer's way of saying run. So if region equals east, then we're going to run this get region total function. And when we say region, we're going to be referring to what we pass into these parentheses. So region will have the value of east if the user inputs east into the input box, and west if they inputs west to the input box, and so on and so forth. Alright, so that's all we need in our get region from user function. And now we're going to begin building out this get region total function. First two things we're going to do in the second subroutine are, first we need to figure out how many rows are in our data. And then we're going to create a variable that's going to store the total amount spent in whatever particular region we're looking in. So let's do that first part. Let's figure out how many rows our data is. So first we're going to declare an integer, and we'll just call it number of rows. Declare that as an integer. And we're going to copy and paste that and set it equal to range A1. I'll type the code and then explain what this code is actually doing. .n xl down .row -1. Alright, so we haven't covered end on this page yet, so that's what I want to talk about first. So range A1, that's cell A1, and we're going to end xl down. So what does that mean? So let's go to cell A1. What end xl down will do is it will take us to the last row of data when we're going down. So you can actually use this end function and you can go to any direction. But when I do down, what it's going to do is it will take me all the way down to this last row. So this is our last row of data. So if I were to do, let's say I was to do A1 and XL right, that would take me to the right and take me to the last column. Or I could do left and that would bring me back to the A column. But we want to see how many rows are in our data. So to do that, we're doing end XL down. which takes us to row 1001. And then, didn't mean to click there. And then we're getting the row number of that row, and we're subtracting 1. So there are 1000 actual rows of data, excluding headers. But this is row 1001, and that's because this is actually, that count is including the header. So we have 1000 rows of data we want to sift through. So that's why we subtract 1, to account for the fact that we don't want to search our header. Alright, so that's with that line of code. And this variable will now contain the number of rows. We also need a variable to keep track of our running total for how much was spent in that region. So we'll declare a currency variable. We'll just call it total spent. And we're actually going to declare this as a currency since we're dealing with dollar amounts. And we'll give that initial value 0 because we're going to go through all of our rows. And if that row occurred in the region of interest, then we're going to add that to our total spent variable. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to use a with construction and anchor our code on cell A1. So what that means is we're going to treat A1 as sort of our anchor, and we're going to use that to relatively reference other cells. So we'll be able to use cell references with respect to A1, and we're going to use that using the offset keyword. And you can offset by rows or columns. So if we're in cell A1 and I wanted to offset 5 rows, then that would take me down 5 rows. So I can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I were to offset A1 by 5 rows, that would bring me down to A6. If I were to offset A1 by 5 columns, that would take me to the right 5 columns. And that would be B, C, D, E, F. So if I were to offset A1 by 5 columns, that would put me into F1. So that's how offset works. And we're going to anchor the A1 to make this offset much easier to deal with. And the with construction just sort of gives us that anchor. I'll have another video that's more in depth about the with construction, but that's a decent intro for now. We're just going to use that it'll give us less code to write, and it'll give us a easier reference point. Alright, so now we're going to create our for loop. So for I is going to be a temporary variable that's an integer, and we're going to give it an initial value of 1. I just want to space that out properly. And now we need to tell it how many times we want this loop to run. So it's going to start with an initial value of 1, and we're going to use this to keyword to specify when we should stop. And we want it to stop at the number of rows. So we have 1000 rows in our data, so this loop will execute 1000 times. I'll also have another video that's more in depth about for loops, so be on the lookout for that. And while we're inside our loop, we're saying what do we want to do for each row in our data. And well, we want to compare the region of that row to the region of interest that was passed into this function. So what's the region of the row of each data? Well, we'll just call it selected region, and we'll declare that as a string. And selected region will be equal to, actually let's go look at our second row of data. Remember, this is all with reference to cell A1, and we want to get the region. So we need to offset by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 rows. And we're going to offset by I. Remember, I is a temporary variable that starts at 1 and ends with 1000. So initially we're going to offset by 1 row, which is number of rows. Which is I. And by 10 columns. So we can come back here. And we don't need to actually say range A1 dot offset. And we're going to offset by I rows. Because remember, I is going to start at 1 and end with 1000. So this will loop us through our entire data set, through all of our rows. And we're going to do 10 for the column offset. And we got to use dot value. If we only did offset, that would just give us that cell. But we actually want the value from that cell, which is why we have to use this dot value keyword. And that's going to give us the selected region. So once again, if we were to offset by 1 row and 10 columns, then that would bring us to cell K2, which gives us the region. Alright, so now that we have our selected region, we actually have to compare that to the region that was passed into this subroutine. So here we can just do another if statement. If selected region, make sure you type everything properly, equals region, which is this region, which was passed in wherever we do our function call. Then what we want to do is take our total variable and update it. So we want this to be a running total. We don't want to overwrite this variable. We want it to be a running total. So if there's 10 spent and then 20 spent, we want it to be 30. We don't want it to just be 20. So we can do total equals total plus range A1 dot offset I8 dot value. And the reason why we offset by 8 rows is because, remember, we know region we had to offset by 10. And so column spent is 2 columns to the right of region, so we can offset by 8. It's also positive to do negative offsets. So if E1 was my reference, I could do -4 column offset, which will bring me to column A. But we don't need to do that in this video since we're using A1 as our anchor. And I also mentioned earlier, we actually don't need this range A1, and that is because we're using this with statement. So we can actually just delete these. We can delete that, and we can delete this here also. And every time we do a dot, because we're inside of a with construction, VBA automatically knows that it's the same as if we had range A1 offset. And that's all we need in our if statement. So we can end our if and go back one level of indentation. Now we actually need to make sure that this I variable updates. Right now it's set to 1, but we don't have anything to actually add 1 to it. So we have to add this next I, which is telling I to become its next value. So our loop will continue to run and it will work properly. And we need to end our with construction. Tell VBA that we're done with that. And lastly, we can do a message box, and we can just say our revenue from the, and this ampersand is how you can combine strings in order to, in the message box you can combine strings. So this is just a concatenation operator, and we're going to tell them region, and we want to pass in the variable here. So if they enter east, then we'll say our revenue from the east region is so-and-so, and if it was west, it will say our revenue from the west region is so-and-so. Then we're going to have to concatenate again, and we're going to have a $sign. Then we're going to concatenate again, and tell them our total spent. Then we're going to concatenate one last time, and simply add a period. It should be total spent and not total. So if you made the same mistake as me, then you should go back and change that to total spent. And now let's go to our worksheet, and I'm going to show you how you can add a button. So I already have this button here. I will just delete that. And to add a button, make sure you're on your developer tab. You can click button, and then click on your screen. And it will say which macro do you want to assign to that button. We're going to assign our get region from user. And you can double click the button, and then highlight the text and change it. So we'll say get regional spending, and then once that catches up, we can click off the button. Alright, now when you click this button, it'll ask you to enter a region, let's say east, and it will say our revenue from the east region is that amount. Alright, so let's check this one more time, but this time we're going to enter some random stuff. So that way we enter some random stuff and click OK, and it'll say error, please enter a valid region. Alright, so that's how you can create an application in VBA. This is just a really simple application that will give you a summary for regional spending. And so if you like this video, then please comment, like, and subscribe. You should subscribe because every week we're posting videos about either VBA, Python, data visualization with Tableau, or cloud computing with Amazon Web Services. And we have a lot of good content planned for you, so please subscribe. And when you do subscribe, what you should do is comment and say, I subscribe. And that way I'll be able to like your comment or heart it. I'll try to get to all of the comments if possible. And also, please feel free to follow us on Instagram and Twitter. And visit us on Python.com, where you can see the 4 courses we have posted on game development in Python and Python basics. Alright, so thanks for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.